Listen, there are a lot of reasons that I consider Hunter x Hunter to be the greatest anime ever created. The world building, the lack of plot holes, the lovable characters, but more importantly than anything, the incredibly diverse and rich power system. Listen, there are entire pages of college level explanations explaining how you can exactly determine who will win in a battle using AP and SP in an equation given to us by Togashi, on top of incredibly rich explanations of the 6 different types of Nen users and how they can apply those Nen types to different types of techniques, and how separate subcategories of Nen play into different Nen techniques and how those give you advantages in battle. When it comes to power systems, there is no power system as complicated yet as fleshed out as Nen, which is why when you want to talk about things like the 15 strongest Nen techniques, it's kind of an uphill battle, because within the confines of such a complicated power system, a lot of different things can be gauged as powerful. There's incredibly potent defensive Nen techniques, offensive Nen techniques, healing Nen techniques, sealing Nen techniques. We have brand new Nen techniques being introduced every single week in the manga with spiritual Nen beasts, and we still haven't even made it to the Dark Continent, where I'm sure Nen will be completely rewritten once again. But just because it's uphill sledding doesn't mean I'm not gonna do it. I'm not a coward after all. So today we're gonna be talking about the 15 strongest Nen techniques in Hunter x Hunter, specifically the offensive capabilities granted by said techniques. So you won't see anything like Pakunoda's Spirit Bomb or the abilities of the Nen Exorcist. While those techniques are incredibly important to the storyline and very useful offensively, they don't add up to much. So today we're just talking about the stuff that packs a punch. So now that we have the rules set for this list, let's go ahead and get into the list. In the 15 strongest Nen techniques in Hunter x Hunter, ranked and explained. But before we get to ranking and explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Nen techniques. Even when you're only considering the offensive power of an Nen technique, it's incredibly hard to rank them, because while other power systems like chakra or bending rely on elemental releases, Nen techniques rely on the difference in how Nen is used. Who's to say that an enhancement technique is necessarily stronger than a manipulation technique? And while enhancement techniques have been called the perfect blend of offense and defense, some of the strongest abilities we've seen in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter have been things like transmuter techniques or emitter techniques, not to mention specialist techniques. But with all that in mind, I am gonna try my hardest here to give you the most coherent ranking of Nen techniques ever created, but no promises. But with the caveats out of the way, let's get jumping into this list with number 15, Beelzebub. I know it's insane that the lowest ability on this list is one of the key abilities of one of the Royal Guard, but when considering the strength of the Royal Guard, their real strength comes in, well, their strength, and also their speed and intelligence in Nen output. I believe Yuppie is the best example of this. While Yuppie's enhancement ability to change the form of his body to grow wings or additional arms is incredibly cool, when considered against a myriad of different Nen abilities, it's arguably not that strong. Instead, Yuppie's true strength comes from his raw strength, his speed, his reactions, and his Nen output. Now, I wouldn't say that's exactly the case for Pouf, though it could be argued, and I would be one to argue it, that Pouf is the weakest of the Royal Guard. His Nen abilities are arguably some of the more interesting in the show. And while he has abilities like Spiritual Message and Cocoon, I want to talk about Beelzebub, mostly because we're gonna sort of talk about Spiritual Message later. You'll see. This technique, Beelzebub, gives Pouf a molecular control over his own body. And I mean molecular. See, while people like Yuppie can control the shape of their body and make wings or additional hands or additional eyes, Pouf's control goes several degrees beyond that. See, Pouf is able to break himself into multiple segments, and when I say multiple, I mean almost limitless amounts. See, Pouf has complete control over every single molecule in his body, but since the conservation of mass does apply to Shaiapouf, he can only split himself into equally massed segments. That is to say that Shaiapouf could split himself in half and make 2 half-size versions of himself, or he could make an almost limitless amount of nano-sized Shaiapoufs. And when I say nano-size, I mean a nanometer, 10 to the -9th. And this is powerful for a lot of reasons that are explored in Hunter x Hunter and a lot of reasons that aren't explored in Hunter x Hunter. One, like I stated earlier, if you make yourself nano-sized, you are technically limitless. This means that Shaiapouf is roughly breaking down every single molecule in his body to be a miniature version of himself, meaning that Shaiapouf can direct every single molecule in his body wherever he needs it to go. The only problem with this is that any Shaiapouf smaller than a fly cannot see, but that's not necessarily a problem because every singular Shaiapouf can be directed telepathically, which means that let's say I am Shaiapouf, I could turn my hand into a bunch of nano-sized me's. And while of course these nano-sized me's can't see because they're too small to have eyes, I could direct these nano-sized me's wherever I would need them to go. However, if I were to break my hand into a bunch of fly-sized me's, every single one of those flies that's flying around now has its own set of eyes and ears and smell and every sense. And Shaiapouf is able to tap into every single one of those senses simultaneously, implying that, let's say hypothetically, I don't know, how many flies do you think you could make out of a body? Millions? Shaiapouf could have millions of sensory points spread out God knows how far, because we don't even know if there's a limit to Beelzebub's capabilities. Genuinely, the only problem with his technique is that these little clones are significantly weaker than full-size Shaiapouf. And if these little clones are destroyed with something like electricity or fire, Shaiapouf cannot recreate them. However, if they're just destroyed with something like a punch, they can be regenerated. This technique not only makes Poof almost impossible to capture, it also means he could just do what I said earlier and turn his hand into a bunch of nano-sized hymns. And while he never does this in Hunter x Hunter, he could just feed those nano-sized molecules into your body through your mouth, your nose, your ears, and then he could just telepathically direct them around your heart and then recreate his heart in your chest and squeeze. And that's ignoring the fact that since Poof has control over his own molecular structure, he can recreate his Shaiapoufs to look like whatever he wants, going so far as to once recreate Komogi. But since breaking up his body into these millions of little pieces makes him significantly more vulnerable than he usually is, that's why we're at number 15 here. Coming up at number 14, we have another manipulation technique, and it's coming from another insane narcissist with beautiful hair, Illumi. See, basically any of Illumi's techniques could have been added onto this list, but I genuinely believe the strongest technique that Illumi has is needle peep. See, Illumi as a manipulator is able to channel his aura into needles. And should Illumi place one of these needles in somebody's skull, he is able to control them. And that's all he needs. Illumi imbues these needles with a massive amount of aura and places them in unsuspecting or suspecting people's skulls. Upon placing a needle in somebody's head, Illumi is then able to usher a basic command to these people. Let's say the command is charge Nick's phone. The needle person afflicted with this mission will try to charge my phone until they either die or die of exhaustion, meaning that essentially with simply the placement of one needle in one skull, Illumi is able to make a non-thinking, non-sentient, endlessly driven army of people. And we've seen him do this. Not to mention, upon getting a needle in your skull, you're basically dead. Some people have been able to survive getting a needle in their skull, but they were permanently crippled afterwards. And not like I'm gonna go compete in the Paralympics, like I'm breathing out of a tube for the rest of my very short and painful life. And while the command that Illumi holds over a body with one needle is a bit shaky, in that the person won't really operate or act like a regular person, and they'll just try to compete the goal that they were given while kind of acting zombie-ish. Should Illumi increase the amount of needles in somebody's skull, it's shown that these needle people can do complicated things, like hold a conversation or drive. Not to mention, this also works on corpses. And while we understand that Illumi has a massive amount of Nen, we've never really seen a limit to how many needle people he can have at once, implying that using needle people on just one person really isn't that exhaustive to it, giving Illumi quite possibly the easiest way to build an army in the history of people in Hunter x Hunter. But enough about Illumi, let's talk about his boyfriend, Hisoka. I mean, come on guys, let's be real here. If we're talking about Hisoka and we're talking about Nen abilities, do you guys have a guess what we're gonna talk about? Is it bungee gum? Outside of the fact that bungee gum has the properties of both rubber and gum, there is also a myriad of different reasons that it's proven to be one of the strongest Nen abilities in Hunter x Hunter. Bungee gum, while in premise may not sound like the strongest Nen ability, has the highest level of versatility we've seen out of any technique in Hunter x Hunter maybe ever. I mean, of course, Hisoka is supernaturally strong, quick, intuitive, he has massive amounts of Nen, but really what's allowed him to fight on par with the likes of Chrollo is bungee gum. Bungee gum over the duration of Hunter x Hunter's run has proven to be incredibly potent offensively, defensively, supplementary, because Hisoka is shown to be able to create bungee gum with his fingers, his hands, and his feet even. On top of that, Hisoka seems to be able to extend his aura almost limitlessly, and since it is his aura, he can command it to snap back to him whenever he wants. This was shown when he attached bungee gum to Gon's cheek and he snapped Gon back to him. On top of that, since this is his aura and it does have the properties of both rubber and gum, it's incredible for defense. Hisoka, upon stretching his aura in front of him, has been shown to be able to stop things no other hunter could dream of, like how Hisoka was able to stop Goto's coins, or catch a ball shot with the entirety of a full blast Gon rock smash. On top of that, since his bungee gum stretches and retracts at his own command, he can make flail-like weapons with incredibly deadly intent using this technique, like in his battle against Chrollo, where he used the decapitated head in conjunction with his bungee gum to wipe out hundreds of people. Tie this into the fact that Hisoka probably has the highest battle IQ in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter. Giving him such a versatile weapon has shown how many different ways bungee gum can be used. Like in his battle against Chrollo, where he attached a part of his bungee gum to himself and had it stretch, and then he retracted it in order to retreat quickly. So listen, while I understand that you may or may not think bungee gum is a super powerful technique and it's only strong because it's in Hisoka's hands, it's kind of hard to separate the art from the artist when we're talking about bungee gum because it was created by Hisoka. But enough about Illumi's boyfriend, let's talk about Illumi's brother, Killua. Killua is our co-main protagonist of this show, and thus when we're talking about strongest nen abilities, there's a lot of things we could touch on with Killua. But when it boils down to the strongest nen users in the show, unfortunately Killua doesn't really match up. That is, except for in one category, speed. See, Killua is a transmuter, just like his brother's boyfriend. However, instead of transmuting his aura into bungee gum, Killua has transmuted his aura into something electric-like. It's not actual electricity because that would be conjuration, but by transmuting his aura into basically electricity, Killua has been able to achieve a monstrous amount of things. Things like lightning palm, thunderbolt, but most importantly, godspeed. By the way, since I'm trying to keep this list as non-convoluted as possible, I'm not talking about speed of lightning, I'm talking about godspeed. See, godspeed is what happens when Killua cloaks himself in his lightning-like aura. Godspeed was created by Killua to increase his reaction speed. The way reaction speed usually works is, let's say I have my hand on a desk or something, and this pencil falls and hits my hand. The nerves in my hands have to then send a signal up my arm through my chest into my brain to tell my brain that I'm feeling pain from this pencil hitting it, and then my brain has to send a message to my hand to move. Now, this is an incredibly fast process for the majority of people. However, if your name's Killua, this is far too slow. So by covering himself entirely in essentially electricity, Killua is able to bypass his own nervous system, meaning that his aura immediately upon sensing a threat or physical contact sends a signal to his muscles to move, making Killua hundreds of times faster than he already was. On top of this, Killua's godspeed can be pre-programmed, making it even quicker. If Killua pre-programs his godspeed to react to malevolent intent or enemy contact, it will react without him even thinking about it. Essentially, Godspeed puts Killua's body in autopilot. And by pre-programming this Godspeed, Killua is able to use an ability called Whirlwind. If hypothetically Killua programmed his aura to react to a punch, Killua's body will naturally dodge for him, which means he can use his now free brain power to strike back. This is how he was able to land attacks against Yubi. Combine this with speed of lightning that allows Killua to move between 200 and 300 miles an hour, depending where you scale it. It's a pretty crazy ability. And crazy is a great word to explain the next entry on our list from the strongest royal guard, Pitou. See, while Pitou's nen ability, Dr. Blythe, is not offensive at all, and in fact it's the manifestation of a giant creepy doll doctor that's able to heal people from basically life-ending injuries in a matter of hours. Occasionally, and I mean very occasionally, Pitou does bust out some offensive techniques. The most specific of these being Terpsichora, also known as Puppet Master's Serenity. Now this technique is really only ever seen like twice-ish. During the initial dragon dive used by Zeno Zoldyck, it's used, and then after Pitou dies, it's used. See, we actually don't even know what type of nen this technique is. But considering the fact that Nefer Pitou's limbs get swollen with muscles upon using this, people believe it's an enhancement technique. However, since this technique does quite literally generate a massive ballerina that controls Pitou using strings, it could also be a transmutation or a conjuration technique, or even a specialist technique. But upon using this technique, Pitou is no longer in control, and in fact, they themselves have become the puppet. And this technique is activated fast. It takes 0.1 second upon being manifested to use this technique offensively. The best testament to this technique's strength is the fact that after Pitou's death, we saw this technique cut off one of adult Gon's arms. And while it's loosely stated that Gon let one of his arms get cut off, the fact that this technique was able to even pull an arm off of adult Gon is saying something, because adult Gon is equal to Meruem pre-Rose. We learned that ironically from Pitou. And mind you, that version of Meruem survived Netero's zero hand. And while he was cut up and scratched and bleeding in a couple of different places, he wasn't missing an arm or a leg, meaning that if this technique was used against Meruem, it could hypothetically rip off one of his arms. And since we can only assume that the durability of adult Gon and the durability of Meruem are equal, if this technique could injure adult Gon in a way that Zero Hand couldn't injure Meruem, it's hard not to point at this technique and say,
It might be stronger than Zero Hand.
but that is an absolute ton of speculation, and it was only accessible to Pitou after death because of their loyalty to the king. So for that reason, it's this low. And then once again, we don't really know what was going on with Gon in the moment, because once again, it is loosely implied that he let Pitou take his arm. But enough about techniques we don't understand, let's talk about techniques we very much do understand. Coming in with number 10, being Big Bang Impact. I know what everyone's screaming right now.
Nick, you just use ability used by Uvogin, who dies to an early version of Kurapika, over an ability used by Pitou that was able to sever one of Gon's adult arms?
Listen, post-mortem Nen is insanely powerful. And if you gotta die to have the strongest version of your technique, well, I'm sorry, I can't put it that high. Top of that, we understand Big Bang Impact very well. Big Bang Impact is the pinnacle of enhancement techniques. It's essentially like Gon's Jaja Ken in adult form, except Uvogin doesn't have to give his entire life to do it. This technique is a Ko punch. And for those of you who haven't seen my Nen Explained video, 1, go watch my Nen Explained video, but 2, Ko is when you use Gyo to direct all of your Nen to one place of your body. And for Uvogin, that meant directing all of his aura into his right hand. Upon delivering a right-handed straight punch, and only a right-handed straight punch, Uvogin is able to deliver a blow with the destructive force of a small missile. We've seen the straight punch eliminate some of the strongest Nen users we've ever been introduced to in the show, the Shadow Beasts, and create massive craters. And what's scary about Uvogin is the fact that he was trying to make this punch as strong as a nuclear warhead. Now, the reason this technique was so strong is because Uvogin could only use it in a right straight punch. And by placing such a specific limitation on it, the strength of the punch got stronger. Outside of killing the Shadow Beast, though, this technique was also strong enough to shatter Kurapika's arm while he was using Emperor Time. You'll understand why that's so impressive when we talk about Emperor Time, which is actually right now. Perfect segue. Now, talking about Kurapika and Emperor Time is kind of a weird spot, because if we're talking about Kurapika's abilities against the Phantom Troop, then it could arguably be top 3 on this list, as a fair amount of his stronger abilities can only be used against the spiders. So I'm slightly conflicted on whether I should only talk about Emperor Time or talk about all of Kurapika's chain abilities. Let's start with Emperor Time. See, Kurapika is a conjurer. Now, being a conjurer is kind of unfortunate. The same could be said about manipulation, because directly next to manipulation and conjuration is specialist. This is unfortunate because while usually somebody has 80% access to the 2 techniques to the left and right of their technique, you can't have an 80% access to specialization. Thus, as a conjurer, Kurapika has access to 100% of conjuration techniques, 80% of transmutation, 60% of enhancement, 40% of emission, you get it. And the problem is, Kurapika doesn't want that, which is fair. I wouldn't want that nerf either. Well, Kurapika realized that when his eyes turned scarlet, he turned into a specialist. And upon turning into a specialist, he could use every different kind of Nen at 100% efficiency. Well, it's not exactly like that, but for the sake of this video, let's say it's like that. But the problem is, Kurapika's eyes can't be scarlet all the time, unless they could be. See, Kurapika created the ability Emperor Time to allow himself to change his eyes to scarlet whenever he needed. The only problem is there's a trade-off for this. While turning his eyes scarlet turns him into a specialist that can use every type of Nen at 100% efficiency, power, and accuracy, making him essentially one of the strongest Nen users on Earth every time this is activated. Every second that Emperor Time is activated takes an hour off of Kurapika's life. So every 24 seconds he uses this technique is a day gone, which would mean roughly every 3.5 minutes is a week gone, and so on and so forth. The fact that Uvogin was able to break his arm while he was using Emperor Time, which gave him 100% access to enhancement techniques, on top of the fact that he was using his conjured chain to protect his arm, is insane. On top of that, when he's using Emperor Time, he's able to use different chains on his hand that he's usually not able to use, like the Judgment Chain or Stealth Dolphin. Obviously, other chains on Kurapika's hands, like Chain Jail, are incredibly powerful, but only against the Phantom Troop, because this is a conjured chain that puts anybody bound into it into an immediate point of Zetsu. I mean, that was strong enough to lock up people like Uvogin, said to be the physically strongest member of the Phantom Troop and arguably their best enhancer. Not even arguably, their best enhancer. And then there's things like his Holy Chain that can heal a myriad of different injuries, but using all those different kind of Nen abilities feels like cheating, so let's just talk about Emperor Time. Keeping with Kurapika's favorite people, next up on our list is a technique used by Feitan. Well, Feitan's speed and strength is usually enough to put him over basically every single enemy he comes across. In a rare circumstance where Feitan is pushed into a corner, he has a different technique. A technique referred to as Pain Packer. You see, this is a conjuration technique, which is kind of terrifying when you consider Feitan's speed and strength. This technique can only be conjured after Feitan takes a certain amount of damage. And upon receiving that certain amount of damage, Feitan becomes enraged and conjures the Pain Packer suit. The Pain Packer suit not only protects him from pretty much all damage, but it also protects him from the ensuing technique that goes along with the Pain Packer suit. On top of protecting him from damage, the Pain Packer suit also massively increases his aura output. And also it's implied by Finks that the Pain Packer suit that we saw is just one variation of many. The real strength of the Pain Packer suit though comes with the ensuing technique, Rising Sun, where Feitan channels all of the damage he's taken over the course of the fight into physical aura. And depending on the amount of damage Feitan has taken in combat, the larger and the hotter the aura, which manifests as a miniature sun, becomes. This miniature sun, upon being created, is then thrown at an enemy, and believe it or not, it kills them because it's a sun. The Pain Packer suit protects Feitan from the heat and also supplies him with a steady supply of oxygen, because all of the oxygen around a sun is immediately combusted. However, the fact that this is a counteractive technique, which implies that Feitan has to receive a certain amount of damage, which could inevitably result in his death, puts us at that kind of low spot. It's not that low though, like 8's still pretty high. Coming in at number 7 is our second Zoldyck on this list, Zeno Zoldyck's Dragon Head. It's important to place a caveat here that Zeno Zoldyck is almost 70 years old and far out of his prime. With that stated, Dragon Head has still proved to be one of the strongest techniques in the entirety of Hunter x Hunter. Dragon's Head is a transmutation technique, just like with Killua, except instead of transmuting his aura into electricity, he transmutes it into a dragon. Zeno is able to control this Dragon Head to shoot at opponents or even fire it off from his body in an emission technique. And because this aura is physical, this Dragon Head can also be used defensively or as a means of transport, as shown when Zeno and Netero travel to the NGL on the back of Zeno's dragon. On top of that, since Zeno was such a powerful transmuter and emitter, he can control this dragon from kilometers away, as shown when he flew Meruem and Netero away from the palace for kilometers. Dragonhead has been shown to be strong enough to injure and or incapacitate the likes of Chrollo. This technique is so powerful that when it touched Pitou's end, they finally registered something as a threat. On top of that, Dragon Head can be used for abilities like Dragon Lance, which is the thing that hurt Chrollo, or Dragon Dive. Dragon's Dive, which splits the dragon into hundreds, if not thousands of projectiles, which are able to punch through entire castles with their force. An ability that would be able to wipe out a battlefield of mid-level Nen users in one go. Now, you could probably argue that Silva's Aura Balls probably deserve to be on this list right next to Zeno, considering the fact that Zeno stated that Silva's Aura Balls would kill Chrollo and him simultaneously, but it was Zeno's Dragon Head that was holding Chrollo in that place. So honestly, it's a toss-up either way, but we've just seen more from Dragon Head than the Aura Balls. Coming up at number 6 is gonna garner a little bit of hate. And honestly, I'm ready for it. Because coming up at number 6, we have Limitation Transformation. What is that, you ask? It's what happens when Gon turns into an adult.
Nick, are you being serious? You just put the technique that put Gon on level with pre-Rose Meruem at number 6?
Yeah, I did. Listen, all right? Give me a second. The way that this technique works is basically Nen Restrictions 101. In the same way that Kurapika is able to make Chain Jail strong enough to hold Uvogin by saying that it will only be used against the spiders, Gon was able to make a vow with himself in his aura that basically put his entire life on the line, making his transformation really powerful. Upon hearing that Kite was gone and that Pitou was simply stalling to keep Gon away from the king, Gon created a vow that stated that he wanted all of the power he would ever have, essentially making Gon the strongest he was ever going to be in his lifetime at that moment, in exchange for his entire life. Now, when it comes to Nen-related restrictions, putting your life on the line is the strongest thing you can do. Now, in the state, Gon was arguably a top 3 strongest person in the entirety of the show. Pitou feared that in this form, he would be able to take on Meruem. Killua, upon seeing the form, said it would take decades of Gon training to achieve this level of strength, and he was so powerful he was able to easily dodge Pitou's strongest attack, one we've already talked about today, Terpsichore. And considering the fact that this technique pushed Pitou beyond their limits, the fact that Gon made it look like child's play is terrifying. Gon, upon dodging this attack, then kicks Pitou about 100 meters into the air. A Gon that made Pitou spit out blood and arguably probably permanently crippled them. This is terrifying when you consider the fact that Pitou got hit by Netero and was fine. And in this form, it only took 3 to 4 Jaja Ken rocks to wipe Pitou off the face of the earth. Now, the reason I say this technique is this low on the slate is because of the consequences. This technique can only be used once, and if it doesn't kill you, it will make you unable to use Nen for the rest of your life, which is why Gon isn't currently on the Black Whale heading to the Dark Continent. He cannot use Nen anymore. If not for Nanika's ability to quite literally make anything reality, he would have died. The vow that he made was so powerful that upon releasing it, a pillar of aura was shot out of the tent where he was being kept. It stated that any regular Nen exorcist trying to break this vow would have died immediately. If it weren't for the fact that Nanika's wish granting ability is basically limitless, that would have been GG's. So while yes, a couple of the techniques coming up after this technique are weaker than this technique, they don't kill the user. The first of which, and the newest of which, is Parallel Future. This is a technique used by the fourth prince of Kakin, Tserriednich. And while this technique is brand new to the Hunter x Hunter timeline, and we really haven't seen it used in battle that much yet, the possibilities of this technique are insane. And there's very much a reason this technique is at number 5. Arguably, it could be higher. Parallel Future is activated when the fourth prince closes his eyes and activates Zetsu. Zetsu being shutting off your aura. Upon accomplishing this, the fourth prince sees 10 seconds into the future. But the ability is a bit more complicated than that. See, the fourth prince sees 10 seconds into the future immediately, which means let's say I close my eyes and I activate Zetsu. Right now, I'm seeing 10 seconds into the future. But at the same time, my body is experiencing real time, which means that throughout this entire process, my body is experiencing real time. My brain is seeing the future. So let's say during this process, while I'm seeing the future with my eyes closed and Zetsu activated, I'm seeing 10 seconds ahead of wherever my body currently is. Which means that if I stay in this form for, let's say, 10 seconds, I would see, even after closing my eyes, the next 10 seconds that are about to happen. But if I keep my eyes closed and remain in Zetsu, I can continually see 10 seconds ahead of what my body is experiencing. It's not until I open my eyes that I start to relive the future I've already seen. And in these 10 seconds where I start to relive the future I've already seen, I can change my actions and change the future. But what's really unique about this ability is that, let's say in this future that I've already foreseen, you shoot me. So you have a gun to my head. Since I've seen the future where you shoot me, I dodge that bullet. And while surviving is cool and all, the person who's shooting me and all of the people around me see me get shot. See, anything changed in the 10 seconds after opening my eyes is what everybody around me will see. In essence, think of it like a genjutsu. They see the world as it was supposed to happen, not as it's actually happening. Which means that if at second 4 I dodge your bullet, I pull out a knife and I stab you in the neck, you die, but you thought you shot me. In those 10 seconds, there is nothing that you can change. You will simply do exactly what you were going to do in those 10 seconds. And in those 10 seconds, I can do whatever I want and you cannot react to it, but your body will reflect it. But after those 10 seconds, normal time will continue to pass, which means that if I stab you at second 10, let's say, you would bleed out and normal time would pass and everybody would see you bleeding out, but everybody would have thought you just shot me in the brain and be real confused. And this technique can be used over and over and over again. Simply by closing my eyes and achieving Zetsu, I can continually jump 10 seconds into the future. And in those 10 seconds in the future, there is nothing you can do, change, or interact with. The only reason this technique is not top 2 or top 3 is because we've only seen it used once. But the possibilities of this technique are almost limitless. Speaking of almost limitless possibilities, the next entry on the list embodies that to a T, because next up at number 4 is Skill Hunter. Now, am I going to talk about every single one of the abilities stolen using Skill Hunter? No. We're just talking about Skill Hunter. Skill Hunter is a specialist technique used by Chrollo, and this ability allows Chrollo to steal the Nen abilities of others using his book, which is conjured, called Banded Secret. But this isn't just copying the ability of somebody else, it is quite literally taking that ability away from them and they can never use it again. But how does Chrollo steal these Nen abilities? Well, there's 4 rules that allow him to steal somebody's Nen ability forever. The first is he has to witness the Nen ability with his own eyes. The second is he has to ask the Nen user questions about their Nen ability and have them be answered. The third necessity is that the user of this Nen ability's palm has to touch the cover of Bandit's Secret. And the fourth rule is that all of this has to happen within 1 hour, meaning he can't see your technique one day, ask you questions about it the other, and then have your palm touch the book the other. All of this has to happen in an hour, and that's not easy. On top of all of this, if the user of that Nen ability dies, it disappears from Bandit's secret. However, upon stealing a technique, it becomes a page in Bandit's secret. And Chrollo, upon opening his book to that page and keeping it open on that page, is able to use that technique. Except Chrollo somehow wanted to make this technique even stronger and created another ability called Double Face. This is a conjured bookmark. And upon placing this bookmark on the page of an ability he wants to use, even if he flips to a new page, he can still use that ability, giving Chrollo the ability to use 2 different abilities at once. Or if Chrollo doesn't need to use 2 different abilities, but he wants to use both hands and not hold the book open, Chrollo can place this bookmark in the page of an ability he wants to use and close and put down his book. He had to create this technique in order to use abilities that required both of his hands, like Sun and Moon. Having the ability to essentially have endless Nen abilities is crazy, especially when you consider the fact that Chrollo is naturally a specialist, which means that he can use all different types of Nen at high levels of efficiency. So whether he's stealing an enhancement technique, a conjuration technique, a transmutation technique, he can use all of them roughly as well as the original user. Tie that into the fact that outside of Hisoka, he probably has the highest battle IQ out of anybody in the show, and you have one of the most dangerous techniques in one of the most dangerous hands ever, especially when you consider the fact that the stipulations he has to go through to steal abilities isn't that strict. One of them is seeing the ability, and then Chrollo just has to ask one question while fighting. Then if Chrollo happens to knock out the person whose ability he wants to steal, he can simply take their unconscious hand and put it on the book, and then we're good. Now, this doesn't work against the highest level of Nen users like Zeno and Silva, because they understand that he has to go through a certain amount of steps to steal an ability. But still, there is weak people out there or dumb people out there with very useful abilities, which is how Chrollo's been able to steal what we can assume is dozens of abilities. However, unfortunately, if you steal an ability, will you truly ever master it? And would you rather have dozens of abilities or truly, fully master one of them? I would argue that at the highest level of mastery, it's better to master one technique than to roughly know a bunch, which is why above Skill Hunter, coming in at number 3, is the 100-hand Bodhisattva. This is a manipulation ability used by Isaac Netero, and it was a technique mastered over decades of doing the same exact thing. When Isaac Netero realized that he had reached the peak of his power in his mid-40s and wanted to go beyond that, he wandered out into the wilderness and prayed thousands of times a day. After praying thousands of times a day, Netero realized that he had begun to do this motion superhumanly quick, where he could only do 1,000 prayers and punches a day in the beginning. Towards the end, he was doing 1,000 an hour, till eventually Netero was moving so fast his hands could not be seen. This prayer motion and strike got so fast that it could be completed thousands of times in a minute, resulting in blindingly fast strikes. But these strikes weren't coming from Netero. No, these strikes were coming from a massive godlike deity with 100 arms behind him. The 100-type Guanyin Bodhisattva is the recreation of a Buddhist god. And while we don't know whether or not this Buddhist god is conjured, emitted, or transmuted, it's generally agreed upon that this is a manipulation ability. The reason that it's referred to as 100 type is because within the confines of this ability, there is 100 strikes. And these 100s of strikes are different variations of the dozens of arms of this Buddhist god striking an opponent. But each of these 100 strikes is referred to as a first or a second or a 99th hand, and they are simply a reflection of the movement of Netero. However, since Netero was using these strikes at a speed of thousands per minute, these strikes are not only coming from something that is roughly 100 meters tall and made of metal, but also coming at a speed that Meruem himself could not dodge. This technique was strong enough to keep Meruem at bay and vaguely injure him. And even though the injury was vague, it was able to land hundreds of blows against him. And we're told that Netero at one point was doubly as strong as we see him when he's fighting Meruem, implying that this technique probably would have killed Meruem if they had fought in Netero's prime. However, if the first 99 hands do not work, Netero has access to the 0 hand, a last result that uses the entirety of Netero's aura. The Bodhisattva holds the enemy in their hands and fires an energy beam onto them. The usage of this technique alone injured Meruem more than thousands of 1 through 99 hand strikes, implying that it is possibly thousands of times more powerful than any of the other hands. And while obviously this technique in that current capacity wasn't enough to defeat Meruem, being able to keep Meruem at bay, strike him thousands of times, and even injure him superficially is enough, especially when we consider the fact that this was his technique at 50% power. But since we're talking about Meruem, let's talk about Meruem, because coming in at number 2 is Meruem's ability, Nen Synthesis. Meruem has Skill Hunter without the rules. Meruem, upon devouring a Nen user, gains their Nen ability. There's no asking questions, there's no having to see the Nen ability. If Meruem eats you, and we're not sure how much of you he needs to eat, he gets your Nen ability. Through the usage of this technique, Meruem was able to gain the abilities of both Pouf and Yuppie, with Yuppie's abilities giving him the ability to sprout wings and control his body at will, and the abilities of Pouf manifesting a bit differently. See, you know how I said we were going to talk about spiritual message later? Well, upon consuming the majority of Pouf's body, Meruem was able to use spiritual message, but differently. See, while Pouf's spiritual message allows him to manifest scales that can assess situations around him, Meruem was able to manifest this ability in the form of something called Photon, which operates exactly like spiritual message, except instead of large noticeable scales, these are literal photons, meaning not only can they travel at the speed of light, but they're also basically imperceptible. And Meruem can use this ability for everything that spiritual message can be used for, meaning that Meruem can read whether or not people are lying or their aura amount simply by having enough photons near to them. On top of this, we've seen that Meruem may or may not be able to manifest himself, i.e. teleportation, using this technique, which means, once again, unlike Skill Hunter, not only can Meruem steal a technique and technically still have the person who he stole it from be able to use it, but also there's no caveats and he can upgrade the versions of the abilities he steals. So yeah, it's the better version of Skill Hunter. However, unfortunately for Isaac, Netero, Chrollo, and Meruem, there's a little girl that's stronger than all of them combined. Well, more like there's an entity that lives in a little girl that's stronger than all of them combined, but you get it. Aluka slash Nanika, on top of just being so gosh darn cute, is also the strongest entity in Hunter x Hunter currently. See, within Aluka lives an entity by the name of Nanika. Now, as to what Nanika is, we're not entirely sure, but theories dictate that Nanika is an eye. An eye is one of the 5 catastrophes brought back from the Dark Continent. And while there is technically a bunch of rules to activate Nanika, in essence, all we need to know for the scope of today's video is that Nanika is able to grant wishes. Any wish. And if hypothetically Nanika is dealing with somebody that she loves, like with Killua, there's actually no rules. Killua can simply ask Nanika, hey, can you do this? And Nanika will make it happen. It's been speculated that there is quite literally no limitations to what this can accomplish. It is though implied that Nanika may be worse at healing than destroying, as Nanika had to come into physical contact with Gon to heal him. So considering the fact that currently we know of no limitations to Nanika's ability, it's gotta be number 1. Yeah, stealing abilities is cool and all, but hypothetically Nanika could just smush Meruem. And that's it. The 15 strongest Nen abilities in Hunter x Hunter, at least offensively. Do you guys agree with my list? Would you have had anything on here that I don't currently have? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I don't know what it is about Hunter x Hunter that I just end up making like 45-minute videos, but it always plays out that way.